There is a cliche you see in so many Hollywood movies about writers. The writer is blocked. The writer cannot create. He or she is agonizing in this paralysis. Then suddenly, inspiration arrives. They sit down at their manual typewriter, chunk, 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 and as the dawn sun rises, next to the exhausted sleeping writer is a completed manuscript. Now, I believe in inspiration, but the literary process doesn't work this way. Once in a million times, a really trained writer will sit down and create something in a single draft. But most writers have learned how to take the place they start and turn it step by step into a finished work that does what they intend. Years ago, I was asked by the New York Public Library to curate an exhibition of great poems in manuscript. I was working with unbelievably interesting things. Manuscripts by John Donne, T.S. Eliot, Sylvia Plath, Elizabeth Bishop, William Butler Yeats. And looking at them, I learned two things. First was that the revision process was part of the creative act. Secondly, that a certain kind of writer has a genius for revision, and those are the writers that we end up reading. I remember looking at a first draft of a poem by William Butler Yeats, a very famous poem, and as I looked at it, I said, I can write this well with my first drafts. My first drafts are even better than this. But as I followed it through about 15 drafts to Yeats's final poem, I said, there's no way that I could have written that poem. And what I saw was Yeats's genius for taking the core of the idea that he had expressed, sometimes rather clumsily in the first draft, and turning it into something that just made your mind expand and your heart ache with beauty. So what is revision then? I think a simple way of thinking about it is that revision is not something separate from creativity. Revision is a natural and necessary part of the creative act. You start with inspiration. You have an idea. You draft it out as well as you possibly can. But then you have to find a way of stepping away and becoming objective about that to see what's working and what's not working. I think that tends to lead you into doing four things. The first, and this is fairly obvious, is that you cut what isn't working. Now, for years, I've edited poetry anthologies. In fact, there's a shelf of them that I've done over here. And as I go through the correcting the proofs, I am always reminded, I'm shocked, in fact, to discover how short great poems are. Often how short great stories are. The writer has cut out everything that doesn't work. But the second step is a refinement of the first. You cut, but sometimes it's more important to condense. Sometimes you'll be saying more or less the same thing in 3 or 4 lines, and you're doing that because you know it's important. The reader has to see, has to feel, has to taste that thing. But rather than sort of adding up with a lot of details, take those 4 lines, those 5 lines, and condense them into one line. Revise until you have one line that has a kind of perfection, a kind of resonance about it. That's the other thing I notice when I'm editing these books, is I read these poems and usually there's not a line that isn't in some ways really effective. There are no bad lines and there are many great ones. The third step of revision is shaping your material. Now, this is a little harder to talk about because it's specific to each piece you're working on. A way of thinking about it is that you're creating a journey for your reader, a journey of image, of emotion, of story, of sound. How do you want them to experience that? What is the pace that you want them to experience. Now, usually in a poem or a story, there's one moment, or maybe sometimes two moments, where you feel the energy of the poem radiating. You say, yes, that's the thing that makes me know that this is a real poem. Make sure that you understand how to get the reader there and how to get the reader away from there. That is essential. Sometimes it just takes too long to get to that moment. Sometimes you get out of it too abruptly. The fourth part of revision is finishing the poem, polishing it, completing it. Now, this is one where you need to have some objectivity because you've been inside this poem. You can no longer absolutely see it in a fair and objective way. My advice is to send it to a friend. Send it to somebody who has not seen any of the drafts and get their reaction. Now, you can do this yourself. The Roman poet Horace kept his poems for 7 years before he published them. He would take them out, and then he would see what needed to be done. He would do it and send it out. But you may not have 7 years to wait. What I would advise is sending the work to a friend who has not seen any of the drafts. Get their reaction about what works, what doesn't work. There may just be a single word that you've misjudged. There might be a line that's either obscure or unnecessary. An outsider will be able to see that immediately in a way that you won't. The history of literature is full of examples of cutting and condensing. My favorite one is the story of T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Wasteland. He took his draft and he gave it to Ezra Pound. Pound cut half of the poem away. He even changed the title to The Wasteland. Eliot's title was He Do the Police in Different Voices, an allusion to a Dickens novel that no one would have recognized. In the process, Pound turned Eliot's poem from what would have been a curiosity into the central poem of the modernist movement, not just in English, but internationally. That's the power that cutting and condensing can do. It can take a brilliant idea and refine it into a masterpiece. Revision is not an embarrassing admission that you failed in drafting out a poem. It's also not a cold and clinical act of copy editing your own text. Revision is the power to re-enter your own inspiration with the same openness and intensity that you brought to creating the first draft. Revision is re-entering your vision and expressing it more clearly. If you want to master writing, you need to master revision.